Go back to Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister Goodale, Ontario's Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne recently announced that her government plans to retail cannabis through a government-owned control board. Now, last week, the committee learned that the state of Colorado, in fact, any state, could not pursue such a model of public distribution because it would have put state employees in the position of breaking federal U.S. law by trafficking in cannabis. So, Minister, given that employees of the Cannabis Control Board of Ontario will be involved in the sale of cannabis, will this affect their admissibility to the United States, in your view?
No, because they have not violated any American law.
Minister of Justice, Michael Spratt, a lawyer, testified to this before this committee that Bill C-45 leaves intact.
They have not violated any law, not just American law.
Well, not yet. Leaves intact the criminalization of cannabis in many circumstances that will harm vulnerable Canadians. I want to quote from his testimony. An adult who possesses 30 grams of marijuana in public is a criminal. A youth who possesses more than 5 grams of marijuana is a criminal. An 18-year-old who passes a joint to their 17-year-old friend is a criminal. An adult who grows 5 marijuana plants is a criminal. An adult who lets his 1-meter-tall marijuana plant grow an extra centimeter is a criminal. This continued criminalization is inconsistent with a rational and evidence-based criminal justice policy and will only serve to reduce some of the positive impacts of this bill. The asymmetrical criminalization of marijuana will only serve to perpetuate the disproportionate enforcement of laws on the young, the marginalized, and racialized members of our society. Minister, you know that Indigenous, racialized, and marginalized people are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system and are disproportionately harmed by a criminal approach to drug laws. By maintaining a criminalized approach to cannabis, C-45 will perpetuate this discriminatory impact. Why have you done so?
Well, first of all, I mean, we are proceeding on a comprehensive review of the criminal justice system, targeting specifically to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous and marginalized individuals in the criminal justice system. What we've done with the proposed Cannabis Act and Bill C-45, as I said earlier in my comments, is to put a diversity of sanctions within the Act, from ticketing to the more serious criminal prosecutions that could arise. So there is an opportunity to proceed by way of ticketing for many of the offenses that you've mentioned, between 30 and 50 grams of possession for an adult. For youth, there's the opportunity, well, you go through the Criminal Justice Act, but there's also the opportunity to proceed in other manners that law enforcement officers.
The question, Minister, though, with respect is, do you not agree that this act will continue to have a disproportionate effect on racialized and Indigenous people?
The purpose of this act, as you've quite rightly pointed out, is in Section 7, and the purpose is to ensure that we legalize, strictly regulate, to keep cannabis out of the hands of young people and the proceeds out of the hands of criminals. We have an obligation, and I'm endeavoring to work extremely hard in the broader criminal justice system review to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples and marginalized individuals, which has resulted from many factors.
Okay. After introducing Bill C-45, Prime Minister Trudeau told a Vice News town hall that, quote, "Our focus is on making sure we're changing the legislation to fix what's broken, a system that's hurting Canadians. And then we will take steps to look at what we can do for those people who have criminal records for something that will no longer be criminal." But Kathy Thompson, Assistant Deputy Minister for Community Safety and Countering Crime Branch in the Department of Public Safety, told this committee that, quote, "There are no plans at this time to introduce an automatic pardon as suggested, and there's zero in this bill to deal with pardons." Minister, can you confirm if your government is considering plans to pardon criminal records for offences that will no longer be offences when the proposed legislation comes into force?
We're examining the issue. We have not arrived at any conclusions yet, but obviously we're examining all of the options and all of the ramifications to achieve the objective that the Prime Minister referred to.
Thank you. Back to the Minister of Justice. The McClellan Task Force said Canada's governments and many other organizations will need to work quickly to prepare for the implementation of the new system, increasing our developing capacity in many areas relating to production, distribution, retail, quality control, enforcement, research, and surveillance. Having all elements in place will be necessary for the proper functioning of the regime. And they recommended that the federal government take a leadership role to ensure that capacity is developed among all levels of government prior to the start of the regulatory regime. But when asked if the federal government has been working with Indigenous governments on a nation-to-nation basis to develop that capacity, Ontario Regional Chief Isidore Day told this committee that, quote, "No, they haven't. The legislative process and the capacity and the mutually agreed upon processes as to how that's going to gel and work together to meet an outcome are going to be the challenge that is simply not happening with this government." Minister, given the task force's clear warning that intergovernmental cooperation is critical, and given the Prime Minister's repeated statements that his most important relationship is with Indigenous people, why has your government ignored First Nations governments in building the capacity for C-45 to become law?
Well, I would disagree with the statement that we've ignored Indigenous peoples, and we are firmly committed to engaging on a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples right across this country. I know that Indigenous peoples and communities and organizations had the opportunity to speak with the task force in the production of their report. Likewise, I know that my colleagues and I will continue to engage with Indigenous communities as we proceed towards July of 2018. This is something that we are committed to doing and ensuring that we hear from as many Indigenous communities as we can. And this is a broader discussion around Indigenous governments and the ability of Indigenous communities, whether they're under the Indian Act or have self-government agreements. We're aware of the ability of Indigenous communities that are still living under the Indian Act to make bylaws around intoxicants on their reserves, as well as we are going to continue to understand and engage with Indigenous communities that have self-governed agreements and provide for their ability to move forward in this manner. And I know my colleague, Minister Pettipas-Taylor, is continuing to engage with respect to the health aspects and the realities in Indigenous communities on an ongoing basis.
Thanks very much. Now, that brings to a close our normal round of questions.